Okay, we're starting our recording of our meeting, and this is a video conference with 5 people. We'll all identify ourselves. I'm Dr. John Mason, and I am the facilitator, the main facilitator and founder of a community called Masters of the Journey. We have an interest in supporting people who wish to develop their consciousness and move along their path to higher consciousness. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about the subject of death and dying. We're going to start by having the perspective of how we might manage our fear and our anxiety if we're living with that, or if it's causing us to not live as fully and completely as we could be. So I'd like to throw that out there. And if Jorge, could you just start by introducing yourself?
Gladly, of course, yes. My name is Jorge Manzanera, and I'm a certified bilingual mediator that is doing a lot of outreach about emotional intelligence and conflict resolution being 2 skills to develop together. And I know John for a couple of years now. He's great. He's been a great mentor and a great friend. So I was excited to be part of the call. I'm not an expert in death or dying. I've done some, let's say, experience of my own. I'll be happy to share those. Maybe this Mexican culture can be of some interest at some point as well. So I'm happy to have somebody else talking about fear and anxiety. I think these 2 things might go together as you, for instance, get sick or as you become much more fragile. And I think that that's when you start thinking of death maybe more often. But I'll let others share their point of view, and I'll be happy to be back in the conversation anytime. Thanks.
Great. Amari, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Amari Magdalena. I've been a minister for 23 years, been present for death and dying, also an author, and I teach earth-based spirituality or shamanism, which has a lot of benefits for helping people cope with death. And my own experiences, I mean, we'll talk about that when you're through with introductions, but from childhood where we were never exposed to death because of my mother's own fear of it, to then being present for people at the time.
Great. Thank you very much. We don't have a ghost or extraterrestrial, but we do have a friend named Bryce whose computer has got him turned green today. Could you introduce yourself, Bryce?
Okay, I'm Bryce. I don't have any fancy credentials or anything. For myself, fear and anxiety about death seems to be a moot point or not affect me anymore. But I do have concerns about loved ones that are either have passed, soon will pass, or the upcoming someday when they will pass. I don't know what I have to say, but we'll see.
Well, thank you for joining us. And Phyllis, would you give a little introduction, please, yourself?
Okay. I'm Phyllis Schachter. I live in Bellingham, Washington. I think everyone has fear about death and dying at some point in their journey. And when I was 50 years old, I remember meeting with a professional. She was actually a homeopath. And I was very concerned because I couldn't even imagine life without my mother or my husband. And it's now some years later, and neither one of them are here. And I'm just beginning to really thrive, but it's been quite a journey. And my husband voluntarily stopped eating and drinking a little bit more than 3 years ago, so he didn't have to live into the late stages of Alzheimer's disease. I did a TED Talk about this called Not Here by Choice, and I have a very in-depth website under my name, phyllisSchachter.com, sharing our story. And I'm doing a lot of educating today and public speaking and being interviewed and writing about expanding our choices about how and when we die. I wouldn't trade my journey for anything. It's my journey.
Well, that's great. And what I want the people who are watching this to understand is, you might not even realize or understand why you found your way to this video, or why you're actually participating as a viewer of our conversation. And we have people that are obviously, they're not necessarily researchers or medical people. We are people that have an opinion. We have a form of expression because we have lived through some of this experience. I picked up a book from 30 years ago today, and I was looking through it, and it's this book, and I accidentally wrote it about 30 years ago, and one of the reasons why I was writing that book was because I wanted to serve a population. I've done a lot of work with stress and anxiety management, and the two populations on the back end of life's history, the anxiety around aging and the anxiety and stress around death and dying, were two of the areas I was really interested in writing about. And as I was reading through the chapter on death and dying this morning, I realized I knew a lot 30 years ago. I haven't forgotten that much of it, but who knows what I remember. At any rate, from the perspective of that, does anybody want to talk a little bit about how a fear of death or the anxiety of the impending death of another person can get in the way of us living our lives?
Well, in anticipation of my husband dying, after, a wonderful marriage of 26 years, for several years, I mean, I was a caregiver for some years, and the anticipation of that, I would say I was almost in a constant state of anxiety because I didn't want to lose him. Even though it wasn't all rational, I knew people die. I also knew that the journey living with somebody who had Alzheimer's probably wouldn't be a very enjoyable one. But through a lot of conversation and a process we went through, he made the choice that he made. I would say for almost 2 years, I couldn't sleep at night, hardly. I would wake up frequently. And the nanosecond I was awake, the very first thought that would come into my mind is, how is this all going to resolve itself? The anxiety about the unknown. And fortunately, I've been a meditator for 25 years, and I do have a daily yoga practice, and I'm in nature every day, and I had some tools to work with. So most nights I would end up on my meditation cushion in the middle of the night. It was the only thing really that would relax me to get back to sleep. And during the daytime, I mean, I was filled with anxiety. I think a lot of anxiety has to do with the unknown. And I didn't know that I had a lot of anxiety, though. I mean, up to a point. But I'm certainly was operating in a very different way than I do now.
Right. And when you're speaking about this is a loved one that was in a situation where you might lose them. I will say from my own personal experience, my wife passed 4.5 years ago. It wasn't quite what I expected. I think that leading up to her death, which was from a long-term chronic illness, a terminal illness, I thought I was well prepared. But when you're losing the source of a loved one, when you're losing somebody that you care about, it creates a void. And I think that unknown and dealing with that creates a lot of fear and anxiety. I think some of the people that are going to be watching this are going to be in that situation. There's also going to be people who have their own impending doom, their own impending fear of their own, end of life scenario. So, does anybody speak about somebody who's had personal experience with that? Yes, Jorge.
Yes, thank you. Well, I would like to share that for me, it's probably been quite the opposite. Although I've had losses, of course, and for instance, my grandmother, which I also took care of her before she died, together with the rest of the family. And I really like her a lot when things happened, and we were, yeah, sad, but it was something that seemed so natural to me, and at the same time, it was an important loss, but it didn't affect my lifestyle or my quality of life or my communications with others. So it was just some really nice memories that were more active, let's say, about her. So also with my dad, which I grew to, of course, he was always there for me, and he was a great man. And when I had to live in Canada for that year or those few years, and he passed away in Mexico City, and I couldn't actually go to his funeral. I remember having that day, didn't have to go to work because my employer said, well, you have that loss, you can take that tomorrow's day, I mean that same day. And it was somehow, well, it was a nice day of I knew everything was going to be taken care of by my family. And I didn't really feel the need to be there in a way. Like my reflections and my time alone would help me to somehow seal that loss. Somehow, I don't know. I mean, I was, of course, I still remember him dearly, but it's not. There's no pain there. So I don't know. Maybe it's because I wasn't married to either one of them. I can hardly imagine having my wife missing. Which I love dearly, and she's actually 15 years younger than me, so chances are like she will be dealing with my death herself first. And I know it's I've been also, well, moving in a few places, and every time you move around, there's a lot of loss about your friends, your place, your work, your food, your language even. So it's a big loss, and I think maybe I'm somehow resistant to it. I'm just glad that it's that way. I can't imagine having that pain that one of your guests was describing so well.
You know,
so well, that's my experience.
Jorge, you talk about your father dying in Mexico City, and I know that other cultures deal with death a little bit more directly. In American culture, in the North America and the United States, it's my opinion about this, but very often death is pushed away. You got to go to a hospital or to a assisted living, and we're not really dealing with death or dying. It's in our youth culture, it seems like it's a loss or a defeat to be involved with dying. Does anybody want to address any of the cultural issues or the attitudes about that?
If I may very quickly, I agree. There's a big difference. My grandmother and my dad actually died at home. In the case of my grandmother, she was actually using my bedroom, and I had to sleep elsewhere in the house. And it was it was a team actually around her. So it was not so. It was just not. It was not a happy time, but it was like a working type of time for her. Same thing with my dad, although my dad, he smoked his complete life, and he had emphysema, so he had a pretty ugly going, and my mother was actually at that time alone with him, and she's very strong about it, and she got the support that she needed right away from others. So there's those differences. I think Mexicans tend to think that life is not that much of a value sometimes. There's a song that says, La vida no vale nada, which is an old song that says life is not so much worth. So then, but at the same time, it's just this joy of going to the cemetery maybe and having some food in there once a year. And there's a lot of, I didn't never practice on that, because another different thing about me is maybe my religion. I don't have strong religious beliefs. I'm a Unitarian, and I've been more an agnostic for now more than 10, 20, 30 years, I don't know. So it's that is my cultural reference that I can share.
Great.
And I'd like to add something. When my 3-year-old grandson died in Mexico, I came up against a completely different cultural handling of death. Whereas I said earlier, I grew up with, we had no death that we were ever involved in. I never saw a dead person until I was 21. So in Mexico, when he died, and we went down there for the funeral, they keep the body unembalmed out for days before they bury them. And that was shocking to Westerners. And of course, so much of what went on was in the Spanish language, which we had some facility of, but not sufficient. And it was handled in a much more matter-of-fact kind of natural way, even to the extent of the burial. When we went to the cemetery and they had dug the hole, and they had a bulldozer right there, and as soon as it was over, they started bulldozing it, and we're all, and we just gasped because no one prepared us for that. And in America, usually you're putting a little dirt or something and walking away, and you're not seeing the actual, we could say entombment of that person. So that was a very, very different kind of shocking experience. And then when my sister died in England, they keep the body, it is embalmed, but they keep the body for a long time. It was over a week before we actually had the crematorium and the funeral. And that was a completely, I kept thinking, what's going on here that they're not getting through with this? But they even have you watch the casket going into the oven or whatever you call it. And again, we're kind of like, just not at all prepared. But I think that every culture has a different way of dealing with death and dying. And then it's also within the family. My mother's mother died when she was 5 or 6. She had to kiss the dead mother in the casket. She had a great fear of death, and that colored her entire thing. So that I think if we had anxiety about death as we got older, is that we weren't around it, until I was there when my stepfather died, and that was a whole different experience.
Really interesting. Anybody else have any other cultural experiences or an understanding about how the United States deals with death and dying that you want to share?
Well, I'll say a little bit. I don't know if it's particularly about the United States. I would imagine that some practices go cross-culturally. But I think the biggest legacy that my husband left me was demonstrating how to die. Actually, my mother did the same thing. She had a very different kind of death at 95 and a half, and both of them died at home. And because my husband's death was so conscious on his part by just not eating and drinking, and he was at home for those 9.5 days, and then we had a 3-day vigil and at home, and there was 24-hour watch, and it's more of a pagan custom. I kind of borrowed from pagan and Buddhist and Jewish traditions to do what was meaningful for me. And every time I would tell my husband beforehand what it was I was planning on doing, he would say, do whatever you want. I'm not going to be there. And so the vigil was, I think, extremely helpful, because the part that I borrowed from the Jewish tradition was 7 days of sitting Shiva, which is the purpose of having friends and people come to your house for periods of time and sit with you. And it's really to engage deliberately in a mourning process. I covered all the mirrors, so I didn't spend any of my energy at all on how I looked. People brought food to the house and cleaned up for that week. And the first 3 days of sitting Shiva was this vigil, where my husband's body was left never unattended for even a nanosecond. Even when people went to the bathroom, they could see his body in the room. And I think these practices and how the consciousness and deliberateness of this death shifted completely my perspective around death and dying. And also it spurred me to do some very interesting reading, which really began, the reading and my interest in death began about a year, I'd say, before my mother died. I started doing a lot of reading around death and dying. And so I don't know if I'm addressing it that linearly right now, but I think there are probably so many customs that one can participate in. And I'm so grateful that I was willing to do what was meaningful to me and not what was meaningful to others or the society.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, and I know that everybody has different traditions, and in some religious and cultural traditions, they want to get the person in the ground as soon as possible on the first day, and then there's other people who actually sit and they have the memorials and relationships, and it becomes a little bit more real if the family really gets to visit and that person. But in the culture that I live in the United States, it seems like a lot of it is taken care of. It's out of sight, out of mind. If somebody passes away, then they whisk a body off to a mortuary, and then you really, except for writing checks or something, you don't have a lot to do or say. I'm not saying that that's the way it is for everyone. I'm just saying death has become sanitized in our culture. And there's a book, I'm going to hold this book up too. It's called Die Wise, and it's written by a guy by the name of Stephen Jenkinson, who is basically a social worker, very, very educated guy from Harvard Divinity, from Canada. And he speaks a lot about how culture that we live in doesn't really allow us to learn much from the death and dying experience, and that we're lacking because of that. And he's got an entirely different opinion about how we can share this with our family and make it a learning process. I also, because I want Bryce to talk a little bit about this, I picked up the book The Course in Miracles, and because I'm trying to learn how to talk spiritual. I find that the perspective on living and dying are very different, and I know that Bryce is, in my opinion, somewhat of very knowledgeable about how the Course in Miracles looks at one's living and the what happens when we're done with this life. And Bryce, do you want to say something at this point about that?
I don't know. I noticed Jorge mentioned that he was a Unitarian, which, of course, Course in Miracles is Unitarian. Sometimes referred to non-dualistic. Well, the Course in Miracles starts off with a fundamental that says that nothing real can be threatened and nothing unreal exists, and therein lies the peace of God. So at some level, you don't take this world all that seriously because it's not considered real. A lot of people don't like to hear that, and so it's better not to go around saying that stuff. That's the fundamental axiom of A Course in Miracles, and all the rest is just trying to kind of redundantly hammer that into you. So, that doesn't mean we're not here and dealing with things. The reason why we're here, according to the Course, is because of fear and guilt, and a need for forgiveness, that we forgive everybody, everything, absolutely, no compromise. So it doesn't mean that we don't experience fear and guilt and anxiety, but at some point you still have to keep in mind that not to take it too seriously, not to let it get too carried away with you, not to suffer because of it, or not let it run away with suffering. So I don't know. I could really, let me relate one thing that keeps coming up in my mind. Why for a number of years now, I don't feel personally. I don't seem to have any fear of death. I had after my dad passed away and stuff, I had a lucid dream where he seemed to be taking me to this doorway of light. And I thought that was the end. I thought it was you know, ushering me through the doorway to the other side, so to speak. And my genuine attitude was like, okay, so this is it then. You know, I had no fear of it. I had no remorse. I had no any other than, you know, okay, here it is. Let's do this. And of course, it turned out to be a dream. But ever since then, I've come to realize that I'm not really afraid of death or have anxiety about myself. Now, dying's a different deal.
Right.
If I'm going to pass over, I'd like it to be quick and painless. The dying, it's the death itself, I don't care much about. But I you know, like Alzheimer's or cancer or some of these things that are prolonged and painful and dragged out, that's kind of, I have a certain fear of that I wouldn't want to see. From the standpoint of the Course, again, you know, my mom is 90 years old and been sliding since her stroke 3 years ago. It's been getting worse and worse until I say she's like 99% gone. And there again, you know, I don't want her to die and stuff like that, but on some ways I feel like what's waiting on the other side, you know, what's waiting when she's done, is a good thing. You know, how can heaven be a bad thing, you know? I also sense in her, and I've thought this for many years and stuff, that she hangs on because she has a fear of death. She's afraid of it. She's afraid of change in general, but she's afraid of it. And so I think she's hanging on when it might actually be better just for her to pass, you know? I don't know if any of that helps, but that's...
Does anybody have, I've got stuff to say about that, but does anybody else want to jump in?
Yes, I would like to quickly share about the culture. I would say that each culture has a lot of cultures. That experience in Mexico that Doreen or somebody shares is so interesting also for me. I've had different experiences in Mexico, and the fact that most Mexicans are very strong Catholics makes a big difference. And so then that adds to more differences. The other one is also about my fear of not being dead. But, well, at first I think that this same reaction I had towards my grandmother and my mother's death, and my father's death, it will reflect on me having let's say, a less fear for my own death. But I'm really, well, again, as the other person was saying, much more concerned about dying than being dead. So I almost, and then that's where I love the idea of your other guest talking about dying with dignity and being able to choose how and when to die, because most religions would completely oppose that, and I just think it's so important to have that in your fear of dying, being able to manage that, and then of course being respected, especially by the family, in such a decision, and I support it.
John, may I add something? One of the things that helped me overcome fear of death is what's in shamanism is called the shaman's death journey. And in this particular journey, it can be to the upper world or the lower world. As you're going through this journey, you are shedding your flesh. It's all coming off, and you're down to the bones. And it's just, I think, to help us understand the difference between form and essence. And then as we become comfortable with the fact that that's the structure and the rest of it is just add-ons, then we're better able to take it back on knowing that it has a temporariness to it. But I wanted to add another thing about helping people that have a fear of death too. I mentioned that my mother was terrified of death. When my sister died in England, it wasn't Shiva that they were doing, Phyllis, but it was just that's how long it took them apparently to do the burial. But my sister was in a funeral home and we were all at the house. Her husband didn't want the body there. And I finally said, isn't anyone going to go visit Leanne? And they're all like, my God. And so I said, well, I'm going to go. And anyone that wants to come with me is welcome to come with me. Well, my mother decided to come. And this was horrendous for her. But we went there, and first of all, people die, they look very peaceful if they've had, a more natural death. And I just started telling stories, and my mother kind of got into it. And then she began to relax with the fact that this was her daughter's body, but her spirit and who she was still with us. And at one point, I was telling a joke, and it almost looked like she smiled. And my mother said, "She smiled at us." And I said, in spirit, she's smiling at us. So I think that those of us that have come to a place of comfort in whatever way we've achieved it can help other people. And I've helped people pass, go through because I've had a near-death experience. I've helped them go through that process of what will happen and going through the tunnel and seeing the light and seeing the loved ones there, or the images of the loved ones there. So I think there's many things that we that have experienced death that have impacted us in a deep way can help others, get to a place where they're more comfortable. And yet I do agree with both Bryce and Jorge that our own dying process, could be problematic, except that's why I chose to be in states where you can choose how you want to die.
Well, and that there are also a number of different ways of choosing. So a lot of the educating I'm doing, actually a few weeks before my husband died, he was sitting at our breakfast table and he was crying. And when I asked him why he was crying, he said, "I'm not afraid of dying. I've lived a good life, but I want everyone to know about VSED." So he was actually thinking compassionately about others, because so much, as you say, is the suffering can occur at the end of life. And I want to add about the book that John mentioned, because I'm just about done reading it, and we'll read it again for a second time, because Stephen Jenkinson talks throughout the book about the challenge that palliative care does, because it extends the suffering. It doesn't allow people to actually acknowledge that they are dying and to do the inner work they need to do to prepare themselves, to die. And I watched my husband, because he made the decision 6 months before he actually went through this process. He did a lot of inner work to prepare himself to have a very conscious death. And so I think a lot of fear can be dropped through that. He was actually curious about what was to come next, and he was absolutely certain about that there would be some things that would come next. And he had visions of people from the other side about 2 months before he died, on 2 occasions that he said were very real. And since he died, although I don't talk about this much, but I've had communication with him since the 12th day of his death. I've done it through automatic writing. I probably have 3 inches of writing. And so many gifts I feel have been bestowed upon me through his demonstration. And it's important that we know that we have choice. That's where I think so much education has to go on. And there'll be a lot of people who will choose to extend their living as long as they can and to suffer through it. And I say that without judgment.
Phyllis, you used initials. Would you tell everybody what those initials are and what it means?
Oh, VSED, voluntary stopping eating and drinking. Of course, it's nothing new. The Jains culture in India, many of those people die through voluntary stopping eating and drinking. I imagine that in other cultures, 150, 200 years ago, that a lot of people died that way when there was choice between food that would be available for a young person or was it going to be given to the elderly. So there are ways. On the other hand, I don't want to make it sound so simple. We had 24-hour care by a very good doctor who made 3 house calls. I had 24-hour caregivers in the house, in addition to myself, loving my husband and taking good care of him. So, it's my whole notion of dying has shifted so profoundly because I know I have choice. I know I have choice. This is huge for me.
Yeah.
I never felt that before. Even though the two people, I've been blessed in that the two people who I've loved the most in my life are the closest to my mother and my husband. Both role modeled in very beautiful ways how to die. And I'm very grateful that I get to share these experiences now with people. In October, we're having the first national conference at Seattle University on voluntary stopping eating and drinking. And it's an academic conference, which part of it I can't say I'm really looking forward to because I don't know how much is going to be ripped apart, because all sides will be spoken and addressed. And I'll be one of the speakers, but
I love how you talk about that very important spiritual aspects of dying and death without talking about God, actually, and it's amazing. I am so much in line with that of thinking about energies and about other manifestations other than the ones that are more likely to be heard. At the same time, I think combining that approach of so much energy and something following with the freedom of choosing, which oftentimes I've heard obstacles that it stops you from having that freedom because of all these fears based on the medical field and then apparently the humanistic aspects of things. I love the movie that maybe you've all seen that one about You Don't Know Jack, about Jack Kevorkian. That's a huge.
Yes.
do you know, hey, you know that I don't mean to interrupt you, but the first person that he assisted was a woman who was in the same stage of Alzheimer's as my husband.
Wow.
He was a real pioneer, wasn't he?
Yeah. Right, absolutely, and it's good that now only in a few states there's this, of course, the framework of the death with dignity that allows to have a little bit more freedom. So it's great to see that happening and give people more choices because there's a lot of pain around dying that could be diminished somehow.
Yeah.
I think, Jorge, another thing that you haven't mentioned, but certainly part of your culture and also in other cultures is the Dia de los Muertos, that an opportunity to celebrate the people that are on the other side. And some of us believe that at that time of the year, the veils between realities are very thin. And if you want to try to make contact with your deceased loved ones, that's a time that you can do that. And I was blessed going through that whole thing with my stepfather because he chose me to communicate with after his death. And when he died, he'd been such a huge figure in my life, not always good, but it really brought home to me how magic life is. Here's this person who'd been in my life for 50 some years, dominating my life in lots of ways. And one day they exist and poof, the next day they don't. And it really brought me into kind of I choose to live, while I have this life kind of place. So that was a gift of being right there when someone was going through the process of dying and died and the after part of that.
Bryce, did you have something to say?
Yeah. Well, first of all, actually, I have 3 things on my fingers here. Yeah, that's what my dad decided to do. He stopped eating and drinking. He had a brain tumor, and it was terminal, and they did some surgery, I forgot what it was exactly. It didn't have to do with the tumor. But he evidently decided to just throw in the towel, and he just stopped eating and drinking and passed away. And then speaking of, well, I've had days when I feel he was with me and stuff, but after he passed away, in the year or so after he passed away, I'd have these lucid dreams with him in it, and they'd be so real and stuff that I would wake up, and it would take it would take a while to occur to me, he's not here anymore. Then of course I'd start crying and like that, but the dreams are just so lucid and stuff. Third thing is, you're mentioning books, John, and there's one that people may be interested in. Well, actually more than one, but actually the concept is called Life Between Lives, LBL, by Michael Newton. And the books are like The Destiny of Souls, The Journey of Souls. There's only a few of them.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that helped me a lot, of course, because that really helps with the idea of well, it deals. But he was a hypnotherapist that did past life regression, and in one of his sessions, he stumbled upon that the guy wasn't talking about a past life; he was talking about between lives. And since that, he specialized in it and done hundreds, maybe thousands of case studies. Had an institute talk. One of the books. Are case studies from people that have studied at his institute from all the way around the world and stuff, and it talks about well, one of the reasons I'm a suicide survivor, but I'm not in danger of it anymore or anything. And one of the main things is what I got out of that book was every case study that somebody had committed suicide, the first thing they thought as soon as they did it, they passed over to the other side was, boy, that was stupid. So it tells you, like from that perspective, if you want to believe it. But like I said, I like it because it's not like a single person channeling and saying, oh, this is what Spirit's saying and stuff like that. I mean, he's got hundreds and hundreds of case studies and dozens and dozens of other people that are doing it. And, but it informs you on kind of what happens after you pass, and it also gets into preparing for the next life. So anyhow, that could be some interesting stuff for people to read.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to offer some resources, and I want people to jump on with any techniques that we can help. For people who have stress and anxiety, Phyllis mentioned meditation. And Amari was talking a little bit about people who have come back from a near-death experience. And when I was doing my research for my second book, this guy by the name of Ken Ring, and he was a researcher that interviewed more than 300 people who had near-death experiences. And there was another book that came out about that same time by Raymond Moody called, what was it called? Life After Death?
Life After Life. Oh, yeah.
Life. And Ken Ring, I liked him because he was a researcher, and he really put a lot of information about the people that were resuscitated and brought back from the death and dying experience, sometimes voluntarily, where they thought they should come back. Some were kind of shocked back into their bodies. And the point is that with that perspective, people live differently. If you get rid of the fear of what death is all about, it changes the way you can live. And in my family, my father didn't like change and was very afraid of death and dying. And his death it had a lot of anxiety for him. My mother, on the other hand, was an adventurer, and she was 94 and she was ready. And so she was actually in a position of having a different view of her own mortality. And I know that there's a spectrum on that. But if anybody wants to address any of the meditation techniques or the use of hospice or grief counseling or anything, if anything comes up right now, if you'd like to add in the next few minutes, give people a little tools for how to deal with either their own death or the loss of a loved one. Jorge.
Yes, thank you. Well, first, I think it's an experience that it's just a cycle. We need to confront it somehow. I guess with reading about this is always a good idea. Also, I think hospice gives a free, at least here in Mount Vernon, a grief recovery method of 9 weeks or 8 weeks, where you can go through that grieving process according to your own, let's say, it's just really they walk with you through different aspects of this, and it's really a good thing of doing it. And then they actually requested me to do the one in Spanish for next October. So I'll be giving one in Spanish here in Mount Vernon. If you know of anybody and it's a free training, so you can refer them to hospice, whether it's in English or in Spanish. They offer these not only for death, but other experiences that might be very, very stressful. So that's my recommendation.
I'd like to add just a little bit. My observation of going through a long and deep grieving process myself is that our culture is, I believe, more uncomfortable being around people who are grieving than people who are dying. That I really believe that.
Yeah, a lot.
I think that's very true, Phyllis. And what I would add is try to be a support to the person after the death. You know,
Right.
with my mother, I took her away to the ocean, you know, for a couple of weeks. With other people, I've tried to make a note on my calendar to stay in touch after the period, and also to support their need to grieve for as long as they need to.
Absolutely.
So many people in this culture, and I just wrote a blog about this, it's get over it. You don't get over life-changing events. You're not the same person.
Mm-hmm.
And so to go through it, however long it takes you, whatever, and to have friends or people that have gone through grief to be there to just put their arm around you. They don't have to say anything.
Right.
But just to know that somebody's there that can reach out and touch you. I think it's important.
Yes.
And when my wife had passed, I had 8.5 years to prepare for it. I found out how little I knew. It was a very different experience, and I mean, I had a lot of support and a lot of insight, and it still took me probably 3 years to feel like I was starting to be functional again.
Right.
So everybody does this differently, and it's a process that we shouldn't be afraid of. I mean, to be honest, I say right now, I am blessed to have gone through that experience, as painful and as difficult as it is to continue to go through. I think I've really learned a lot from it, and it's given me a good perspective and purpose in my life.
I say amen to that.
Yes.
Yep.
So I want to tell the viewers here that this is just the first of a series of presentations that we would like to be making, and we'll have these in our library. We would like to talk about people who have survived near-death experiences. We want to talk about people who have very special practices and beliefs that ease them, that help them to manage their fears and anxieties. But there's a lot of information out there, a lot of books on death and dying, and a lot of people who will recommend ways for you to control stress and anxiety and cope with your grief. Don't stop with one source, because what one author might say may not be what you need to hear. And the more you talk about it, the more perspective you can gain. And you're blessed to go through these horrible experiences. I wouldn't wish this on anyone else, but there is so much that adds to my life, knowing what I know, having been through what I've been through. Anybody else have a sign-off before we close it down for today?
Well, John, I do have an acquaintance who has died 4 times, and he wrote a book. I can't remember the title right now. His name's John McCarthy, but he wrote a book and stuff where he interviewed like 40 people or so with near-death experiences and stuff. Perhaps I can connect you up with him, and you might be able to be on one of those other video conferences.
That would be very helpful. I'm sure that I would benefit from it. I think people will by hearing a person speaking about that. I've heard Ken Ring speak, and it was an evening that helped change my perspective on things. So having it straight from the horse's mouth, if you will, is a pretty good experience. And does anybody else have a sign off for today?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. There we have ghosts and aliens. This is terrific. I'm going to stop the recording.